Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Addiction Hope webinar presentation in conjunction with Timberline Knolls Residential Treatment Center. We are pleased to bring you tonight a presentation on DBT and the 12-step model for addiction treatment, featuring our special guest for this evening, Greg Holich of Timberline Knolls. Before I transition this over to Greg for his presentation, I'd like to just go over a couple housekeeping items for all our attendees who are joining us live tonight. Just first to point out that you do have access to a PDF copy of Greg's PowerPoint slides for this evening, which can be found in the handout section of your control panel. So please feel free to download those and access them at any point during his presentation. Also, at the end of Greg's presentation, we will be transitioning to a Q&A portion. So please feel free to submit any questions you might have for Greg on his topic for this evening through the questions pane in your control panel. You can submit those at any time. We will be collecting your questions and then again addressing those at the end of his presentation. Lastly, if you would like to submit credit, a CE credit for this webinar presentation, please be aware that a link will be provided at the end of Greg's presentation in the chat portion of your panel. You will need to directly click on the link and access our evaluation form, which you can complete and submit online in order to get your CE credit. Both the link to the form and a copy of tonight's webinar presentation will be available in a follow-up email after our presentation tonight. So without further ado, I'd like now to transition this over to Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal, for that very nice welcome. I just want to thank Addiction Hope for this opportunity to present on this topic. It's a very important topic when treating individuals with addictions. And before I start, I do want to give a shout out to my DBT team from Timberline Knolls, who I know are listening right now, and I'm grateful that they are here to support. So as Crystal said, this presentation is going to be about DBT and the 12-step model for addiction treatment. My goal for the participants is to gain more knowledge about the general framework of what dialectical behavior therapy is. I'm going to dive into teaching the 4 different modalities of dialectical behavior therapy and how those modalities influence and can be applied with addiction treatment. And finally, more specifically, we're going to talk about the 12 steps and how components of the 12 steps can be infused within the DBT language. So just to give a general overview of what this presentation will be like, I'm going to start off with a discussion on the progression of behavior therapy, where it all started from, and what eventually led behavior therapy to dialectical behavior therapy. I'll give a general overview of DBT, discuss the 4 skill modules, the 12-step philosophy, and then finally finish the presentation with a discussion on dialectics and the infusion of the 12-step principles. So where did it all come from? It's said that behaviorism really developed early on in the early 1900s, and one of the key players in early first wave behaviorism was a man named John Watson, and he's really known for his work with conditioning emotional responses. More specifically, his most popular and famous study was that with little Albert, where he developed a study to induce a conditioned fear response into a child. In addition to John Watson, another famous name in first wave behaviorism that may ring a bell to most of you is that of Ivan Pavlov, and he's known for his work in classical conditioning, where he paired neutral stimulus with that of unconditioned stimulus to create a more conditioned response. Early on behaviorism, the therapist was seen as the expert, And the goal in early behaviorism was really to replace harmful behaviors with new and effective behaviors for the individual. As time went on, the field of psychology developed and grew, and in the early 1960s, this is when a second wave of behaviorism really became popular, and these individuals began to study the thoughts that were related to behaviors. One of the key names in second wave behaviorism is that of Aaron Beck, who developed a popular form of therapy, which is still used today, cognitive behavioral therapy. And second wave behaviorists really started to identify that it's really the way that an individual perceives a situation that is more closely connected to their reaction than the actual situation itself. So the goal of second wave behaviorism and the therapeutic approach is, if we can just change the thoughts that influence behavior, then we can directly influence problem behaviors. Second wave behaviorism, the therapist is also seen as the expert. Following second wave behaviorism, the third wave started to emerge, and this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And third wave behaviorists started to identify that, it's not just trying to get rid of behaviors, it's not just thoughts that influence behaviors. We gotta take a step back here. And we need to recognize that we don't have to always get rid of thoughts to change behavior. What third wave behaviorists started to do was to identify that it's less about pushing away thoughts or getting rid of them or even challenging them. It's more about acceptance of thoughts and allowing behavior to be guided by values and commitments. So this is where you have therapies such as ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, DBT, Dialectical Behavior Therapy, which we're going to talk more about today, and the more current mindfulness-based approaches to help individuals. Third wave behaviorists also really emphasize a collaboration with the client. The client and the therapist are both seen as the expert, and there's an emphasis on the therapeutic relationship between the two. So what is DBT? DBT was developed by Marsha Linehan, and prior to her establishing this form of therapy, like any good researcher, she did countless hours of research. And her research included interviewing clients to really identify what works for individuals and what doesn't work for individuals. After years and years and years of studying and interviewing clients to see what helped them, what didn't help them, her research really fell into two categories of what works and what doesn't work. One half of her clients would give her the feedback of, my therapist is really warm and inviting and validating and extremely compassionate and empathic. However, there's never any change. I just feel stuck. The other half of these individuals that she interviewed stated, my therapist is extremely good at pushing me to change. However, I never feel heard, I never feel validated, and I don't truly feel understood. Marsha Linehan saw the tension behind these two extreme approaches and decided, why don't we develop a therapy that includes both acceptance and the push for change? Dialectical behavior therapy is the integration of acceptance strategies and change strategies through a dialectical process. What does dialectical mean? The root of the word dialectic is di meaning two, and overall dialectics means that two seemingly opposing truths, ideas, concepts, even emotions can exist at the same time and both be equally valid and necessary and make sense given that situation. What that looks like in real life. an individual can both love someone, and at times they can really hate that person, and that can still be a meaningful relationship. So a meaningful relationship in that sense is not the absence of love or hate. At times it's the inclusion of both. Or let's identify the individual that experiences loss. That same individual that experiences loss may feel both sad and happy given the same set of circumstances. Sad because they've just lost an individual that perhaps is close to them, and happy because that individual may be no longer suffering. So we're not looking at sadness or happiness as good or bad given the situation and given the individual's reaction to the situation. Both happiness and sadness make sense. Two seemingly opposing emotions existing at the same time and both being equally valid and relevant as communicators. Now, the overall goal of dialectical behavior therapy is to create a more meaningful life or a life worth living. For those that struggle with addictions, this can be an extremely difficult task or idea to obtain, because for individuals that struggle with addictions, there may be three main things that are getting in the way of that pursuit of a meaningful life. And those three main things often fall through the lens of their thoughts, their emotions, and their urges. Looking first at thoughts. The individual that struggles with using thoughts, perhaps they struggle with intrusive thoughts, judgments. The more that that individual attempts to try and get rid of those thoughts, two things can happen as a result. One, it could lead to more suffering because it becomes this impossible task for the individual. And two, it could lead to more shame. The more the individual attempts to push away those thoughts, other thoughts emerge such as, what's wrong with me for having this thought? I shouldn't have this thought. I'm a bad person for having this thought. I've been sober for 30 years. There's no reason for me to still have these using thoughts. And this can really lead that individual down the road of shame for having thoughts about using. So the more the individual attempts to get rid of thoughts, the more it could lead to a suffering experience or a shameful experience. With emotions, oftentimes substances are used in the service of attempting to get rid of the uncomfortable or aversiveness of certain emotions. However, the more that the individual uses substances to attempt to get rid of or manage an emotion, even that can lead to more suffering. And then finally, urges, the desire to do something. For many of the clients that I work with, I like to always ask them, what is the best way for you to get rid of your urges? Especially within a group setting, that usually falls on deaf ears. No one wants to answer the question, even though most of the time they know exactly what the answer is. But they don't answer because there's fear of, what if I get judged for answering the way I truly feel? However, there's often a brave soul that will raise their hand and they'll say, Greg, the best way for me to get rid of my urge is to give into it. Absolutely. However, if the best way to get rid of an urge is to give into it, and the giving into it is going against that individual's morals, values, or new commitments in life, then the giving into it can lead to more suffering. When thoughts, emotions, and urges are approached through the intention of trying to get rid of, it can lead to more suffering. DBT is not in the service of subtraction. So we're not trying to get rid of the individual's thoughts, emotions, or urges. DBT is in the service of addition. When we look at a meaningful life for the individual client, a meaningful life is not the absence of their thoughts, emotions, and urges. Instead, a meaningful life is the inclusion of thoughts, emotions, and urges with the addition of skills. DBT is a skills-based therapy. So individuals that are involved in dialectical behavior therapy learn skills through instruction, application, modeling, and coaching. In addition to that, there are the 4 basic components of treatment in DBT, which includes weekly individual therapy sessions, a skills training group, telephone consultation, and then team consultation, which is ultimately therapy for the therapists. And we're going to talk about each of those as we move on. One of the core foundational processes of dialectical behavior therapy is that psychopathology stems from the biosocial theory. And the biosocial theory suggests that biological vulnerabilities and social invalidation can lead to emotional dysregulation. Environmental factors can also contribute to emotional vulnerability, and those environmental factors can include upbringing, fusing to the idea that their feelings are wrong, or being judged how they feel. DBT offers a conceptual framework with stages of treatment, and within those stages, there is a prioritization of certain targets for the individual. And different targets are addressed based on the patient's or the client's needs. And it's always approached through a dialectical process of acceptance and change. Oftentimes, individuals that struggle with addictions, their upbringing has them invalidated by their environment, by their family, friends, school, whatever it may be. Oftentimes, individuals that struggle with addictions come from an invalidating environment. And these invalidating environments may teach them that they shouldn't feel the way they feel, or perhaps it leads to more denial of, I'm not feeling the way that I'm feeling. A core principle of DBT is that the therapist always creates a validating environment. We never use the language of judgment, and we never view addictive behavior as a problem. So drinking, drugging, using is never seen through the lens of that is a problem. Instead, we use the language of solution. And we use the language of solution in DBT to really identify the validity of why it makes sense that individual was giving into those urges to engage in that behavior. So ultimately, when working with a client that is struggling with an addiction in DBT, we're not trying to get rid of a problem. We're helping the individual find more effective solutions that will not eventually become a new problem for them. We're always validating that these behaviors served a purpose at one point. However, their solution to manage their thoughts, their emotions, and even their urges have become ineffective. In addition to that, addictive behaviors are not used to punish clients. So we don't want to punish clients for the same problems that led them to treatment in the first place. Therefore, treatment in DBT is not contingent on abstinence. We're recognizing that individuals that struggle to regulate their emotions, or that regulate their emotions through the use of substances, generally have high sensitivity or vulnerability to emotional states, high reactivity or impulsivity to giving into those urges, and it tends to take them longer to return back to their baseline. Weekly individual therapy sessions in DBT is always approached through a hierarchy of behavioral targets. And the therapist is always going to prioritize these behavioral targets based on the most pressing issue that the individual is experiencing in that moment. These behavioral targets include first addressing any life-threatening behaviors and attempting to decrease that. Next, decreasing therapy interfering behaviors, decreasing quality of life interfering behaviors, and then finally the increase of skills development. Starting with the first target behavior, we're decreasing life-threatening behaviors because, as Marsha Linehan has said, it's extremely difficult to help someone who's dead. We're decreasing therapy interfering behaviors because it's extremely difficult to help someone that's not showing up to therapy. Substance abuse is considered a quality of life interfering behavior and is addressed accordingly to the individual. However, if substances and the use of substances is interfering with therapy, then that is addressed as a behavioral target. If the individual is using substances as a means of suicide, then the target behavior is going to increase to life-threatening behavior, and that's going to be addressed. In addition to this hierarchy, the DBT therapist will review a daily diary card, and the diary card in DBT is really an inventory of having the client track their emotions and the intensity of their emotional state, tracking their urges and the intensity of the urges that they have throughout the week, and also tracking whether or not they gave into those urges. In addition to that, they're also tracking the use of skills that they've been learning throughout the therapeutic process. In addition to that, if there is relapse by the individual client, a behavior chain analysis becomes a priority within the therapy session. Whether the relapse was as a means of life-threatening, therapy interfering, or quality of life, behavior chain analysis has the client identify the moment that they gave into the urge and all the precursors that led up to that moment, and an identification of the skills that could have been implemented to decrease the likelihood of giving into that urge. Throughout this process, problem solving and validation is going to be a constant strategy that the therapist is using. We're not getting caught up in the either or, validation or problem solving. We're going to utilize both within the therapeutic session. In addition to the weekly individual therapy sessions, DBT offers what's called telephone consultation, and this idea has a lot of parallels to the 12-step procedure of individuals in a 12-step program contacting their sponsor. It's used on an as-needed basis, and it's to help clients to generalize skills outside of their therapy session. So the DBT therapists will always make themselves available for their clients who are able to call them before acting on a harmful behavior. Now, we stress the commitment to call the therapist before acting on a harmful behavior because we don't want clients to call their therapist after they've given into an urge. This is different from a 12-step program where individuals are encouraged to call their sponsor regardless. The reason why there's a 24-hour rule in telephone consultation in DBT is because we want to prohibit clients from reinforcing maladaptive behavior via the therapist's attention. We do want clients, however, to call early and to call often. And finally, anyone in a DBT program is going to attend a weekly skills training group. And the skills training group, it supplements the work that the client is doing in individual therapy. Typically, these groups consist of 6 to 12 individuals that make a commitment to attend the group for oftentimes an entire year. And these groups consist of a didactic presentation of skills. There's always a mindfulness exercise that is utilized at the beginning of these groups. There's a review of homework and an assignment of homework. And the therapist is always holding clients to their commitments to attend group. So therefore, if an individual is late to group, the therapist will hold them accountable and do problem solving to reinforce them recommitting to being at group on time. So what I like to do now is go over the 4 skill modules in DBT. Looking at your screen, the 4 skill sets in DBT, they're divided into 2 sections, acceptance skills and change skills. And those are the 4 curriculums that clients are going to be exposed to that are involved in a DBT group. So we're going to go through all 4 and discuss how they can relate to the 12 steps. Starting with mindfulness. Now, mindfulness lately, I feel, has become this buzzy word. Everyone's using the word mindfulness, and you may ask 10 people, what is mindfulness? And you may get 10 different answers back. So I want to give the definition of mindfulness through the DBT lens and what it means in dialectical behavior therapy. Mindfulness is an exercise. It's a control of attention. It's not a relaxation exercise. It's not a zoning out. It's not emptying your mind. Mindfulness is about paying attention to the present moment on purpose. Mindfulness is an exercise. I always relate it to traditional exercise. So for example, if someone were to go to the gym and they want to work on their biceps, what would they have to do? Bicep curls. So they have the weight in their hand and they'd have to lift it up. But lifting it up once probably isn't going to be enough. They have to put it back down, lift it up again, put it back down. They have to do reps if they want to strengthen that muscle. That same concept applies to mindfulness. The difference being the muscle that we're working on is our mind and our mind's ability to be in control of attention. So in mindfulness practice, the individual is always given an anchor for their attention, an anchor that's existing in the present moment. Sometimes that anchor comes in the form of breath or music or sensory stimulation. That anchor becomes a point of reference. So as the individual is practicing paying attention to that anchor, inevitably their attention may be pulled away. And as that happens, they commit to bringing their attention back to the anchor. There's a rep. And then attention gets pulled away, and they bring it back to the anchor. There's another rep. So mindfulness practice is not the exclusion of distraction. Mindfulness practice is the inclusion of distraction with the commitment of returning attention back to one thing in the moment in order to do reps for attention. In this way, thoughts, emotions, and urges become just another part of the experience that they're having. We're teaching clients to observe their thoughts and then make choices on whether or not they want those thoughts to become thinking. In DBT, we consider thinking to be another behavior. Thoughts are what we have, and thinking is what we do. And oftentimes for individuals that struggle with addiction, it's not the thought about using that leads to the behavior. It's the thought about using that becomes the thinking about using that is more likely to lead to the behavior. So we're being proactive, and we're having clients practice mindfulness early and often as much as they can, not when they're in states of distress, but to strengthen their mind's ability to be in control of attention and to create some space between thoughts, emotions, and urges and the behavior that they choose to engage in. Next, we have distress tolerance, and distress tolerance supplements mindfulness pretty nicely. Distress tolerance is the application of mindfulness techniques when in a distressing situation. We're teaching clients not to try and get rid of their thoughts, not to get rid of their emotions, and not to get rid of their urges. As we discussed earlier, what is the best way to get rid of an urge? It's to do it. And many clients that struggle with addictions have gotten really good at getting rid of their urges. So we're no longer in the service of trying to get rid of those urges. We're constantly adding things to those experiences. I've written on the slide, our mind works through addition rather than subtraction, and that can be a very powerful statement for many clients to hear. We're constantly adding new experiences, we're adding new thoughts, we're adding new behaviors to the same old thoughts and urges that typically show up. The automatic overlearned behaviors must be replaced with meaningful, healthy, and effective behaviors. And this is really where a lot of that first wave, those first wave concepts apply to DBT, where we're attempting to replace behaviors with new ones. Next, we have one of our change strategies, which is emotion regulation skills. First, we have the client identify what are emotions. Oftentimes, they don't know how to answer this question. I don't really know what emotions are. They're just something I feel. They're uncomfortable. I don't like them. We're teaching clients to become unfused from just depending on the label of emotions to communicate their experiences. And when I say label, I mean the label of anxiety, sadness, guilt, shame, happiness, fear. We're getting clients to not rely solely on using those names to identify their emotional experiences. Instead, we're teaching them to communicate their experiences based on what emotions truly are. Changes in blood pressure, body temperature, heart rate, muscle tension, and also the thoughts that may accompany the emotional experience. So something that I tend to tell clients that tell me how they're feeling, if an individual says, "Greg, I'm feeling really anxious right now," my response to that is, I have no idea what anxious means, because I truly don't. We teach our clients that all of us have very biased definitions of what emotions are because we all experience emotions in much different ways. If a client says to me, "Greg, I'm feeling anxious," I only have one point of reference on what that means, and that's my point of reference. So it becomes invalidating for me to use my definition of anxiety to try and help that client out. In this way, I'm attempting to understand the client from their perspective, through their lens, not through my biased lens. Communicating the experience they have with their emotions in order to increase their awareness of what an emotion truly is. We're also teaching clients to decrease their emotional vulnerability. What are the things that make you more vulnerable to your emotional states, and in what ways does that vulnerability lead to the use of substances? So these things can include lack of sleep, not taking proper medication, poor diet, all these things that could decrease their ability to manage the emotion and increase their vulnerability to those physical emotional states. We're also teaching clients to develop new relationships with their emotions, to reduce the rigidity of how emotions are experienced. This emotion does not always have to equal this behavior. We're expanding the number of ways that a client interacts and responds to those same old emotions. This flowchart right here is something that we utilize a lot in DBT groups, regardless of what the individual is struggling with. We first have them identify their vulnerability factors. What makes you more likely to experience an emotion? What makes you more susceptible to an emotion? Some answers that we hear are, well, I don't get enough sleep, or I have high blood pressure that is unmedicated and untreated, or I get more vulnerable to my emotions when it's really hot outside, or when it's humid. So environmental factors, weather. I feel more vulnerable when I drink coffee. So we're first identifying all the things that make the individual more vulnerable to their emotions, not the things that trigger or prompt the emotion, but the things that are already existing so that when an emotion surfaces, it makes it slightly more unmanageable. Then we discuss prompting events. What is it that you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell that triggers the emotional response? Interpretation of event, what thoughts show up? Biological changes. What happens internally when you're experiencing this emotion? What's your heart doing? What's your body temperature like? Is your heart racing? Do you feel nauseous? Is your stomach upset? And what urges are you having? What thoughts are you having that are related to a desire to do something? Expression. What would I see if you were experiencing this emotion? What would it look like? Would you be crying? Would you be smiling? Would you be frowning? Would you be pacing? Would you be sweating? In what ways are you purposely trying to show an emotion to avoid showing a different emotion? What control do you have? What is it that you say in the face of this emotion? And what is it that you do? What is the action? And then finally, the after effects. What effects does the emotion have on your life, on your relationships, on your commitments? When looking at this flow chart, I always have clients identify the smallest box on here, and they notice it right away. It's the emotion name, and I tell them that's the smallest box on here because it's the least important. I'm more concerned with everything that is the emotion. I'm less concerned about what the name of the emotion actually is. And then finally, we have interpersonal effectiveness skills. For those that struggle with addiction, oftentimes abstinence and sobriety is going to involve other people. And ultimately, a meaningful life or a life worth living will also involve other people. And if a meaningful life involves others, then that means there is a possibility that those individuals may get hurt or become invalidated. And being hurt and invalidated could increase the likelihood of urges showing up. So we teach skills to clients on how to assert themselves, how to communicate their experiences using words instead of actions, to advocate their needs, set limits, and to strengthen the relationships they have with both themselves and with those that are meaningful to them. Some of the work that we do with individuals struggling with addictions is to teach them how to assert themselves with family members and friends of how to be supportive, what support looks like. Because a lot of family members may not know how to support their loved one that's struggling with an addiction. So part of interpersonal effectiveness skills is to teach clients how to teach their loved ones what it means to be supported. So we're going to switch gears now a bit and get into the 12-step philosophy. The Serenity Prayer is something that is very much a part of the 12-step philosophy. Higher power, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This has a very nice parallel to Dialectical Behavior Therapy in that we are accepting things and we're not accepting things as a final truth. Now, I'm not going to go over each of the 12 steps and how it's listed on this next slide, but I do want to spend some time breaking down each of the 12 steps and comparing each of the 12 steps with DBT skills and concepts and how they can relate to each other in the work that you may be doing with individual clients. And we're just recognizing that these 12 steps are just a structured guideline for commitments in life. One may lead to the next, and we're utilizing them as a structured means of honoring commitments. Starting with the first step, admitting that you are powerless over your addiction and that your life has become unmanageable. In DBT, we utilize a skill with clients called radical acceptance. Not only is this a skill, it's a concept, it's a way of living. And radical acceptance is ultimately two things. It's an acknowledgement of reality. It's an acknowledgement of the facts about that reality. Facts of the present moment, this current situation, facts of the past, and even an acknowledgement of the facts related to the limitations of the future. So first and foremost, radical acceptance is an acknowledgement. It's not approval, it's not giving in or giving up, it's noticing. This is my reality. Secondly, radical acceptance is a validation of how that individual feels about that reality. So when working with a client that may struggle with an addiction, radical acceptance could come in the form of, I acknowledge that at times I have thoughts to use and I don't have to like it. Or radical acceptance can come in the form of, I acknowledge that my future will no longer include the use of drugs or alcohol or other substances, and I don't have to like that. So we're constantly acknowledging and validating. Acknowledging and validating. And we're even having clients acknowledge the facts of the past and validating how they feel about those facts of the past. Perhaps they've destroyed relationships, or certain obligations were unable to be met, or goals were not met from the past. So we're utilizing radical acceptance to decrease the likelihood of denial of things of the past and to decrease the likelihood of getting caught up in shame related to the past. DBT is all about bringing attention back to the present moment. We're utilizing the past as a means of validation, acceptance, and we're utilizing the future as a means of motivation and commitments. However, we're always bringing our focus back to this moment. Step 2 and 3 in the 12 steps, coming to believe that there's a power greater than oneself that could restore us to sanity. Step 3, making a decision to turn the will over, our will and our lives over to the care of higher power, or God as we understood him. So step 2 and 3 is turning it over, acknowledging that there's something else, someone else that can help. In DBT, this is willingness over willfulness. Forward movement. Now that I've radically accepted my current situation, the facts of the past and even the facts of the future, now I have a choice to make. Willingness to move forward or willfulness to remain stuck. Step 4, creating a moral inventory of oneself. DBT and other third wave behavioral approaches really emphasize the use of values to guide behavior. In what ways am I going to organize my behavior? Am I going to organize it based on just my thoughts, emotions, and urges? Or am I going to allow my thoughts, emotions, and urges to exist while I organize my behavior based on my values? So in DBT, there's a lot of values work that's done with clients. Step 5, admitting to God, ourselves, or to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So admitting to others that there was a problem, the nature of the problem. And this is where in DBT we utilize interpersonal effectiveness skills, teaching the client ways of communicating what they had done, what they're committed to do in the future, and ways of making amends to both repair relationships and to repair self-respect. Step 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So readiness for change. DBT, foundational principle of dialectical behavior therapy, is living by commitment. So regardless of the thoughts, emotions, and urges that show up, in what ways am I going to organize my behavior? Based on just my thoughts, emotions, and urges, or am I going to allow my commitments in the moment to guide my behavior? Step 7, exploration of drawbacks and limitations. In DBT, we utilize a skill called pros and cons, where we're having the individual identify the benefits, both short-term and long-term, of maladaptive, harmful, addictive behaviors, to seek out the validation of why it made some sense they were giving into those urges, and to compare that to new commitments, new ways of living, new skills to utilize. So even using new healthy coping skills, or DBT skills, we have the client identify, well, what might get in the way of me being effective at utilizing these skills? What might be some drawbacks even of this new commitment I've made in my life? Always going back to willingness and utilizing radical acceptance when it gets tough. Step 8 and 9, taking responsibility and making amends. Again, utilizing interpersonal effectiveness skills to communicate in ways that repair and strengthen relationships, commit to new relationships, and to repair and strengthen one's self-respect in how they communicate, taking on responsibility and making amends. Step 10 is taking a personal inventory. One of the key tools of DBT is the utilization of a diary card, which is an inventory of thoughts, emotions, urges, level of intensity of those things, and also the utilization of skills. We're also strengthening commitments and practicing mindfulness to become more aware of what it is that is important to me, what skills I've been using, and what my emotions, how my emotions are having an effect on my behavior. Step 11, prayer, meditation, and or spiritual activity. In DBT, this is the mindfulness practice. And in addition to that, it's also the improve skill. One of the skills in distress tolerance is improve, and this skill is utilized to, given this moment of current distress, what can I do to make things slightly better? Improve the moment. And then finally, step 12, carry the message to others and practice the principles in all affairs. DBT is all about commitment to skillful action, regardless of what shows up. And it's also teaching these skills to others and to strengthening their application of the skills as well, especially within those meaningful relationships. And finally, I want to talk about this idea called dialectical abstinence in DBT and how it relates to 12 steps. Complete abstinence is the commitment to disengage in all addictive behavior. That has its own set of pros and cons. Most individuals that commit to complete abstinence, their abstinence lasts longer. However, when a relapse does occur, many of these individuals, it takes them much longer to recommit to abstinence, and oftentimes guilt and shame become motivators to unhealthy behaviors. The other side of that is the harm reduction approach, where the individual that struggles with addiction acknowledges slip-ups and does not expect perfection. These individuals tend to be able to recommit more quickly to abstinence. However, commitment to harm reduction could often lead to a quicker relapse. So in DBT, we say that therapy can still be effective even in the face of relapse. Relapse becomes just another problem to solve on the hierarchy. Quality of life interfering behavior. Abstinence in DBT is achieved moment by moment. Yes, we're looking at the big picture of a meaningful life. However, we're also looking at abstinence moment by moment and not getting too overwhelmed with the big picture. Finally, if there is relapse for a client that is in DBT, we want to teach them how to fail well. And that's what we call it, failing well. And we fail well by validating the relapse. And validation is not approving of relapse or even agreeing with it. Validation is simply acknowledging that given what you're going through, it may make some sense why relapse occurred. So validation strategies, first and foremost, leading to change strategies, which is now going to include behavior chain analysis, problem solving. What are the things that led up to that relapse? And what can we do for next time to become more aware of the possibility of a relapse? It's all about recommitting back to abstinence So the synthesis of complete abstinence and harm reduction is what we call dialectical abstinence. I'm looking at the time. We have about 10 more minutes left of this presentation. So I would like to open up the last 10 minutes for any questions that anybody may have related to DBT or anything that I've discussed so far in this presentation.
Thank you so much, Greg. We really appreciate your wonderful presentation. And again, like Greg has noted, we are now opening up this opportunity for questions for a Q&A. So if you do have a question for Greg on his topic of this evening, please feel free to submit that via the question pane of your control panel. And also, while we're getting some questions in, I would like to let all of our attendees know who are still with us. If you would like to receive a CE credit for tonight's presentation, you will need to complete and submit our CE evaluation form. If you look in the chat pane of your control panel, you will see a live link there. Just click on that link. It will take you to our CE evaluation form, which you can fill out and submit all online. And we will be issuing CE certificates to all qualified attendees who completed the full hour presentation and the survey within 10 days. So please be sure to click on the link in the chat pane of your control panel to complete the evaluation form. Also, for anyone who may have missed this, you can access a PDF copy of Greg's slides in the handout section of your control panel, so feel free to download those. And if you missed any portion of Greg's webinar presentation this evening, we will be sending out a recording after the presentation. So you will be getting a copy that you can review as well. So with all that said, Greg, we have a few questions, if it's okay to go ahead and transition to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So first question we have from one of our attendees: how can you cater to clients who do not believe in a greater power, since in the 12 steps you hand over control to God or a higher power?
Yeah, with the framework of DBT, if they don't have a higher power that they can identify, then we just have them do values work. We utilize values as their guiding principles, and we utilize values as the means of change. So they're almost surrendering to their values. They're having values influence their behavior.
Great, thank you so much for addressing that. Another question here from one of our attendees: given the dialectical abstinence approach, do people in recovery count days clean as intensively as traditional 12-step programs?
No, we don't. We try not to get fused with numbers. It's kind of like there's a nice metaphor that's used in the DBT literature, and that's the metaphor of an Olympic athlete that runs marathons and races. A runner is always going to approach every race with the full intention that they're going to win that race. However, do they win every race? Absolutely not. So when they lose a race, they just commit back to, I'm going to win the next one. So we're constantly like moving forward in DBT and not necessarily becoming fused with number of days sober and things like that.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. Another question here: do you have any good book recommendations for therapists wanting to learn more about this, about DBT and this form of treatment for addiction?
Yeah, the best book that I can recommend is actually Marsha Linehan's Skills Training Manual. It's the second edition, came out in 2015. It's simply titled DBT Skills Training, Handouts and Worksheets by Marsha Linehan.
Great, thank you, Greg. Another question here: do you have any comments on modification of DBT in addiction for adolescents, given developmentally poor impulse control, executive function, etc.?
Yeah, when we work with clients that are younger, our younger clients, adolescents, the literature that we use is a little bit more geared towards relationships. It's geared more towards when they go to DBT groups as adolescents, it's a little more like school. Really have them utilize pros and cons, like what do they want their life to be about in the future. And we slow down the process a little bit more with our adolescent clients to teach them the skills in a more hands-on approach.
Great, thank you. Another question here, so I'm going through them. If you have a client that is dealing with an addiction and an eating disorder, do you treat them at the same time, or the addiction first, or the eating disorder first?
They'd both be considered quality of life interfering behaviors. For some, maybe life-threatening behaviors, so they're approached the same way. We see, regardless of whether it's addiction to substances, drinking, drugging, using, we also look at restricting, binging, purging as just other behaviors to work on. So there's really no difference in how it's approached. Regardless of the behavior, DBT is going to approach it in a similar fashion.
Thank you, Greg. Another question here, with the highly resistant client, what have you found to be the most effective way of encouraging / communicating them to quote unquote buy in?
The best way for a resistant client, or maybe one that feels hopeless, is to validate hopelessness and to actually sit with them in hopelessness. We try not to force change too much because forcing change can become invalidation. So we validate hopelessness and sit with them in the process of hopelessness.
Thank you. Another question, what are the benefits of inpatient treatment with clients who are using 5+ days a week?
The benefits of inpatient treatment?
I think it's in the context of DBT treatment inpatient, I believe.
Yeah, so inpatient DBT, I would say the benefit of utilizing DBT in an inpatient setting is that a lot of those life-threatening behaviors can be addressed much more quickly because they're in a safe environment, and they have more access to the, it wouldn't be telephone consultation, it would be skills coaching with available staff 24/7.
Okay, a couple more questions, Greg, if that's okay.
Sure.
How do you navigate DBT therapy and 12-step programs in treatment, i.e. hierarchy of sponsorship, meetings, step work, and the interplay of targets or self-harming behaviors?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. How do you navigate DBT therapy and 12-step programs in treatment? For example, like the hierarchy of sponsorship, meetings, step work, and the interplay of targets or self-harming behaviors.
Yeah, there's no road like A to B with that navigation. It's just a utilization of all those things. So if an individual is wanting to seek sponsorship, we use DBT to help them create that language of being assertive. If there are urges, we help them to practice mindfulness and distress tolerance to recognize their urges more. So I would say the DBT and 12 steps are constantly mixing with each other, which is a great synthesis. If you're using 12 steps, you're oftentimes using DBT and vice versa.
Great, thank you. Another question, can you offer details regarding the diary card? Do you have specific questions for them to complete?
Yeah, oftentimes a diary card is going to consist of mainly an identification of the intensity of their emotions using whatever Likert scale the therapist decides. So it could be 0 through 10, 10 being the most intense that emotion was for that particular day. And they're identifying intensity of emotions based on the physical, so changes in body temperature, blood pressure, muscle tension, the biological characteristics of the emotions. And then you're also targeting specific behaviors, and you're having them to track the urges to engage in those behaviors using the same level of intensity on whatever Likert scale the individual chooses. So individual intensity of an urge typically is focusing on frequency of thoughts and also ways that the urge is contributing to biological changes as well. And then the diary card will also have them identify whether or not they gave into those urges or whether they were able to use a skill in place of those urges. So the diary card becomes a great springboard for discussion in individual sessions so that the therapist can navigate with the client. Okay, let's look at your week. Let's look at the urges that you've had. Let's look at intensity of emotions that you've had. Let's look at skills you've been able to utilize. So we're going to strengthen and reinforce the application of those skills. And if there were any relapses, that's where we're doing a lot of behavior chaining and problem solving to teach skills and to generalize skills to fit into various aspects of their week.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Greg. When working with groups, do you recommend clients be at the same level of sobriety, or can you adjust the format to accommodate new and seasoned clients in recovery?
Regardless of level of sobriety, the dynamics of group in DBT is going to be beneficial to anyone regardless of how long they've been sober. So there's no discrepancy on length of sobriety in a DBT group.
Okay, thanks, Greg. There's just a couple more here.
Okay.
Using DBT with adults with moderate to good insight and cognitive functioning is very helpful. I struggle with using DBT with older adults that have abused alcohol for years with cognitive impairment when cognitive impairment may be present. Any suggestions?
Yeah, there's a lot of good literature out there. There's an individual named Julie Brown who created a skill system from DBT concepts to help individuals that are more cognitively impaired. I can say that name again. It's Julie Brown, and it's the DBT skills system. I would recommend checking out that literature.
Great, thank you. And I think this will be our last question. Can the approach be applied to sexually abused victims struggling with addiction of substances?
Absolutely. A lot of trauma work is done in DBT where we're putting one foot in the past and one foot in the present. So if anyone that had any trauma related to sexual abuse and substances, drinking, drugging, using became their solution to those past events, absolutely DBT is well equipped to handle and to help those individuals.
Thanks, Greg. Sorry, there was one more.
Sure.
Squeeze one more in. How do you work with individuals who had ADHD, which makes using a diary card or skills outside of session more difficult?
Problem solving every single session that they don't do the diary card. So if they come into session without the diary card complete, then session is going to be focused on problem solving barriers to doing the diary card. That would be considered therapy interfering behavior.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, for your time and addressing all of our questions. And thank you so much to all of our attendees who participated and engaged with us. And we just really appreciate having the opportunity to feature Greg. Again, thank you for sharing your expertise on DBT and the 12-step model for addiction treatment. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Craig. And just a quick reminder before we shut everything down for the evening, for our attendees who are still with us tonight, if you have not yet filled out your CE evaluation form, please be sure to do so via the link. There's a live link in the chat pane of your control panel. All you need to do is click on that link to be taken to the online CE evaluation form, which you can complete and submit. You will need to submit the form in order to be eligible for the CE credits. The CE certificates will be, emailed to all qualified attendees within 10 days. So please be sure to do that before you leave for this evening. Again, the link is in the chat pane of our control panel. Lastly, I want to point out one more time, if you have not yet had the opportunity to do so, please access a copy of Greg's slides that he presented to us this evening. There is a PDF copy of those in the handout section of your control panel, which you can download and access for your convenience. And lastly, if you missed any portion of our webinar presentation, we will be sending a follow-up email to all registrants after tonight's session, and there will be a copy of the entire presentation for your viewing convenience. So no worries, if you missed anything, you will be getting a copy of that. So without taking any more time, I would like to thank everyone who participated this evening on behalf of Addiction Hope and Timberline Knolls. If you are in need of any addiction resources, please feel free to visit us at addictionhope.com. We also have a schedule of upcoming events on the site that you can access and sign up for. And to learn more about Timberline Knolls Residential Treatment Center, please feel free to visit their website at timberlineknolls.com. Thank you so much again, Greg, for being with us tonight, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care.
Bye.